Do you believe that there are creatures, neither human nor animal, that knock on your door in the middle of a rainy night and ask to be let in? My name is Harold Boone. I'm 61 years old, a widower, and I live alone in a wooden cabin on the edge of the Allegheny forest. I used to be a wildlife veterinarian. I thought I knew the woods. I thought I had made peace with silence. Until one spring night in 1990, when two small, drenched, red-furred beings stood at my door, standing upright, trembling, and looking at me with eyes that said, "Please, let us in." They weren't bears, not monkeys. They had thumbs. They folded towels. One caused chaos like a child. The other cleaned up like a parent. They weren't wild. They had once lived under control, under rules. I named them Moss and Pip. And over the days that followed, they didn't just turn my world upside down. They gave it meaning. At first, I thought I was saving them. But the truth, they were saving me from loneliness, from a house frozen in memories, from the silence I had mistaken for peace. I once signed a release form that set them free, without knowing who they really were. And now, they had found me again. You see, family isn't always blood. Sometimes, it's two small hands touching your face in the dark, reminding you, you're not alone anymore. If any part of this story finds a home in your heart, I wonder, where in the world are you watching from? What's your name, dear listener? And how far do you think this story can travel? Let's make sure it reaches those who still believe in quiet miracles, and those who don't yet. Give this video a like, subscribe if you feel called to, and help us build a gentle, thoughtful community of Bigfoot believers and forest-hearted souls. From my cabin to yours, sending love, wherever you are. The storm rolled in just after dusk, loud and unruly like a drunk uncle slamming doors at a family reunion. Wind came first. Long shrieks between the eaves of the cabin, bending the spruce trees out front until their tops whipped sideways like they were trying to flee. Then came the rain, slashing the porch in cold diagonals, tapping against the windows in rhythmic, angry patterns. Harold Boone sat in his old rocker by the wood stove, hands curled around a chipped ceramic mug, half full of lukewarm black coffee. His bones ached. Not from anything recent, just the quiet ache that comes from living too long and moving through too many seasons. The radio crackled beside him, AM static. A weatherman out of Pittsburgh was still fighting the airwaves, calling for flash flood warnings and gusts topping 50 miles per hour. Harold didn't flinch. The cabin had held through worse. It had outlasted blizzards, a downed hemlock, and that oil heater fire back in '82. He'd made peace with storms years ago. It was the knock that startled him. Not a bang, not a pounding of fists. A knock, measured, deliberate. 3 soft taps. Then silence. He blinked, unsure. Maybe a branch had hit the door just right. But then it came again. 3 knocks. Same rhythm. Same pause afterward, as if someone, or something, was waiting to be let in. Harold set his mug down without taking his eyes off the front door. The stove hissed behind him. He reached for the flashlight on the shelf but stopped halfway. The cabin was already lit in a warm yellow from the overhead lamp. No need to flood it with white light. Besides, he told himself, coyotes didn't knock. He stood slowly. His knees popped in protest. His flannel shirt hung loose over a thermal undershirt, and his heavy socks made whispery sounds against the wooden floor. As he approached the door, another gust rattled the frame. He waited. Nothing. Then again, tap, tap, tap. Harold unlatched the deadbolt, pulled the door open just a few inches, bracing against the wind. He expected. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe a neighbor's kid in trouble. Maybe an animal. Maybe a hallucination brought on by too much silence. What he saw instead stopped his breath. 2 figures, small, no taller than his waist, covered in soaked, matted fur the color of autumn leaves, deep russet browns and streaks of orange. They stood on 2 legs, upright, still, not huddled like frightened animals, not trembling. They didn't speak. The taller one, the one with darker fur and a broad chest, stepped forward just slightly. The rain streaked down its arms, which were long and limber. Its eyes weren't wild, they weren't animal. They were aware, and they were locked onto Harold. He didn't move. The smaller one, shivering and leaner, fur tangled around its face, stayed half a step behind. Harold's hand tightened on the door frame. What the hell? The taller one raised a hand. Not a paw, a hand. 5 fingers, one opposable thumb, and it didn't reach out. It touched its own chest first, then slowly, deliberately, extended that same hand toward Harold. It didn't step forward. It was asking. The realization cracked through him like lightning striking an old stump. They weren't trying to get in. They were waiting for permission. The rain gusted hard. The smaller one shivered and let out a low, involuntary whine. Not fear, but something deeper. A sound too human in pitch. Harold's eyes dropped to the child's wrist. A ring of bare skin peeked through the fur. Red, rough, like something had once been tied there too tight and too long. He looked back at their faces. Then, without a single word, Harold stepped back. Just one step. It was all the signal they needed. The taller one led. Not rushed, not cautious, just certain. The smaller followed, head ducked, staying close. They crossed the threshold without a word. Harold shut the door against the wind. No locks. He didn't move to barricade anything. He just stood there, wet footprints already soaking into the wooden floor, heart beating like it had when he delivered his first foal in '68. There was a heat that spread across his chest. Not adrenaline, not even fear. It was something stranger, something like a memory trying to get out. He turned, saw them both crouched near the stove. The smaller one, Pip, the name would come later, was curled up tightly, arms around knees, watching the flames as if afraid they might leap. The taller, Moss, sat between Pip and the room, one eye always on Harold. Not in threat, in assessment. Harold understood that look. It was the same look stray dogs gave him back when he used to treat them on the side, before he retired from the animal clinic in Elk County. It wasn't, "Will you hurt me?" It was, "Have you already decided to?" He walked to the kitchen slowly, keeping his movements loose, casual. Poured water into the kettle. Lit the burner. Let the hiss of propane fill the silence. The cabin creaked in rhythm with the storm outside. But inside, something new had settled in. Not just presence, permission. As he reached for the tea bags, a small sound stopped him. The patter of bare feet. He turned. The smaller one, Pip, was right behind him. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that Harold could see the shine of water in the fur, the dirt beneath the nails, and the eyes. Big, curious, and exhausted. The child wasn't afraid of Harold. Not really. It was afraid of something else, something it had run from. And Harold, somehow, had become the opposite of that something. He crouched slowly, careful not to break eye contact. He held out a towel from the rack. Didn't offer it. Just set it on the floor. Pip didn't take it. But Moss stepped forward and picked it up. Then, with gentle, practiced hands, began to pat Pip dry. Harold didn't say a word. He just watched. The hands weren't clumsy. They weren't childlike. They'd done this before. He saw the way Moss checked behind Pip's ears, the way the towel moved in rhythm, like something remembered from a long time ago, or learned by watching someone else do it. Harold sat back on the kitchen step and felt something in his throat catch. He'd been alone in that cabin for 8 years. Since Marlene passed, he hadn't let another soul past his porch since the funeral. Neighbors tried. God knew the church ladies tried. But he'd kept the door shut, kept the silence wrapped around him like a second skin. Now here he was, and the silence had just let itself in, or maybe it had knocked. And he'd finally, for reasons he couldn't name, opened the door. He didn't sleep that night. He watched as Moss arranged a space near the fire with leftover blankets, pillows from the storage chest, even one of Harold's old flannel shirts, which Pip clung to like it still carried warmth. He listened to the rain slow. The wind died down around 3 a.m. Just as Pip let out a soft snore, Moss stayed awake. always between Harold and the door, sitting, watching, not like a guard dog, like a sentinel. At one point just before dawn, Moss turned and looked Harold straight in the eye, and without any movement or signal, Harold felt it. The question, the weight of what had just begun, he didn't have an answer. But he nodded, and Moss lay down. Harold sat back in his chair, coffee long cold. The fire crackled. The storm moved on, and in that quiet, warm hush between night and morning, Harold Boone realized he had just done the one thing he had sworn never to do again. He had let something in, not into his home, into his life. And deep down, past the ache in his joints and the quiet in his heart, he knew nothing would be the same after that knock. Not ever again. It was still dark when Harold woke. Not storm dark, not heavy with wind or the weight of thunder, but the kind of quiet, cool dark that comes after a long night of rain, where the air outside smells like pine bark and soaked earth, and every wooden board in the house seems to breathe with the relief of survival. He didn't rise at first. He just lay there in his old bed, one leg bent, staring at the ceiling, listening. There were sounds. Not birds, not yet. Not the hum of the fridge either. It had that stubborn way of going quiet when he most wanted it to hum. What he heard instead was movement, soft, uncoordinated, scattered like footsteps that didn't know what footsteps were for. He sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes. The room glowed faint amber from the hallway light he'd forgotten to turn off. He didn't mind. The warmth was welcome. It made the cabin feel lived in, less like a museum for one man's loneliness. He stepped into the hallway barefoot, the floor cool but not cold. The movement grew louder now. Not scared, just busy. The kitchen was a mess, and standing in the middle of it, like raccoons who'd learned how to be toddlers, were the two creatures he still couldn't quite bring himself to call anything. Not animals, not humans. Just Moss and Pip. Flour was everywhere. Not just on the counter, but smeared in handprints on the side of the fridge. The sugar jar had been overturned, and tiny footprints tracked it in a loop around the table. The refrigerator door was open. A single egg teetered on the edge of a lower shelf. One of the drawers was pulled out like a makeshift step stool. Pip stood on it now, reaching into the fridge like he was on a treasure hunt. Beside him, Moss stood very still, arms folded, watching Pip with a tightness in his shoulders that looked familiar. Harold leaned against the doorway and cleared his throat. Both turned. Pip froze like a cartoon caught mid-act. A stick of butter dangled from one hand. A confused expression halfway between pride and fear stuck to his face. Moss didn't flinch. He stepped between Pip and Harold. Again that same silent positioning, protective but not panicked, and narrowed his eyes, not in challenge, but calculation. A measuring. Harold sighed, walked to the fridge, gently took the butter from Pip's hand. The small creature didn't resist, just blinked up at him and stepped back. "You two ever heard of a breakfast table?" No answer, of course. Just stares. Pip blinked twice, then sneezed, sending a puff of flour into the air like a tiny ghost. Harold shook his head, trying not to smile. He picked up the egg from the fridge shelf, placed it back in the carton, shut the drawer gently under Pip's feet, and then turned to look at the full catastrophe. The floor looked like a bakery had exploded. One cabinet was still swinging on its hinges. "You know," he muttered, grabbing a dish towel, "when people say make yourself at home, they usually mean don't." He started wiping the counter. Behind him, Pip began sniffing the sugar spilled on the floor, then licked a finger and tapped it in. Moss slapped Pip's hand lightly. Not cruel, controlled. Then stepped over, crouched, and began cleaning with Harold's discarded towel. Harold froze, not at the cleaning, but the way Moss did it. Methodically, with care, with practiced movements. Hands that had clearly done this before. Not just a wild creature mimicking behavior, but something deeper, a muscle memory. He watched as Moss picked up shards of eggshell with his fingertips, nudging them carefully onto a plate. No panic, no confusion, just understanding. Harold's eyes shifted. Noticed, in the mess of it all, that Pip wasn't acting like a kid exploring a strange place. He was acting like someone who'd never been told what was allowed. The way he'd opened the fridge, the way he dug into containers without hesitation, the way he looked at each item like it might vanish. He wasn't curious. He was desperate. Harold looked closer. There was something tucked into the tangled fur near Pip's ribs. A scrap of cloth, torn, faded. Looked like burlap, frayed on the edge. It had stitching, a crude symbol, maybe, or a mark, almost like a tag. Moss saw Harold glance and immediately stepped in front of Pip. Not aggressive, just final. Message received. Harold didn't push. Instead, he reached under the sink, grabbed another rag, and handed it to Moss. They cleaned together for a while, the silence thick with something that wasn't awkwardness, just unfamiliar routine. Then, without prompting, Pip wandered over to the back door, grabbed 2 apples from the basket nearby, and marched outside barefoot. Moss stiffened but let him go, moving to the window, watching. Harold followed. Out in the grass, Pip knelt down, apples in hand. He didn't eat them. He placed them on the ground, then went back inside and came out again with a chunk of bread and a half-finished pear. One by one, he laid the food in a loose circle. Harold watched. A chill worked down his back, not from cold, but from recognition. He'd seen that once, years ago. At the rescue shelter, wolves did it. Not wild ones, but ones born in captivity. The ones who didn't know what packs were, who had been taken too early from their own, would lay food in circles, not for eating, for signaling. It was a behavior born out of absence. Pip returned to the porch, sat on the top step, and stared at the circle, like he was waiting. Moss stood inside the door, one hand still on the frame, watching the woods beyond. Later, when Harold went to fetch firewood, he found something that made his stomach twist. The inside latch on the door had been broken, snapped deliberately. It was small, easy to miss, but he knew that latch. He'd installed it himself, and now it was splintered at the base. He looked back at the house, at Pip, still sitting quietly on the porch, at Moss, who met his gaze through the window and didn't blink. Moss had broken it. Not in fear, not in anger. To stop Pip from running, Harold didn't know why that hit him so hard. He stood there, log in hand, trying to steady his breath. Not because he felt betrayed, but because he understood. Moss was managing something, someone, and maybe he had been for a very long time. That night, while the fire burned low and the cabin quieted down, Harold sat in his rocker again, watching them. Pip was curled on the rug, snoring softly. One arm stretched toward the fire like a child reaching for a nightlight. Moss sat beside him, back against the couch, head tilted just enough to stay alert. Harold noticed something else then. His boots. His old work boots had been lined up neatly by the door, laces tucked in, toes pointed outward. He hadn't done that, and he hadn't asked anyone to. He looked at Moss, at the way the creature's arms rested across his knees, relaxed but never unaware. At the subtle way his gaze tracked everything. Harold's breath, the flame's flicker, even the faint wind that nudged the curtain once or twice. Harold thought of the scratch around Pip's wrist, the way Moss had stepped forward last night, offering a chest-to-chest gesture before coming inside. The way he cleaned, the way he controlled. He thought of all the animals he'd treated in his life. The way a caged creature forgets what wild feels like. The way some never really learn it again, no matter how far you drive them from fences. These two hadn't just wandered out of the forest. They'd been kept, managed, trained maybe, or punished. And now, here they were, in his home, uninvited, but unmistakably deliberate. They weren't wild. They weren't lost. They were escaping something structured. And Harold Boone, 61 years old, widower, ex-vet, man who hadn't let anything new into his life in nearly a decade, was sitting in his living room, across from two guests who followed rules no one had written for them. Rules he didn't know yet, rules they hadn't forgotten, even now. As he dimmed the lamp and watched Moss shift slightly closer to Pip's side, one arm gently draped over the smaller frame, Harold felt it again, that ache in the chest, that strange, terrible warmth of recognition. He hadn't adopted them. They hadn't asked to be saved. But they were here, and for now, that meant something he didn't have words for yet. He turned toward the window. Outside, the yard was still, the trees black against the deeper black of night. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once, and Harold Boone sat in his chair, eyes wide open, realizing, maybe for the first time in years, that he wasn't waiting for the world to end anymore. He was waiting to understand what had already begun. It started with the clothesline, not in a dramatic way. No torn sheets flapping like warning flags or claw marks on laundry poles. Just a towel. A single, neatly folded blue-striped towel that had gone missing from Mrs. Hawthorne's line and reappeared 2 days later, draped delicately over Harold's porch railing. Still damp, still smelling faintly of lavender detergent. Harold noticed it mid-morning, coffee cup in one hand, and stood there blinking like someone had found his wallet and left it with interest. Pip had sugar on his nose. Again, the boy, Harold still struggled to think of him any other way, was crouched under the table with an empty peanut butter jar, using a wooden spoon like a shovel. Moss sat on the windowsill, facing out, still as driftwood, tracking something in the trees. He hadn't moved in 10 minutes. Harold didn't ask. Not yet. He stepped outside, touched the towel, and scanned the tree line. It was quiet, damp with the leftovers of a spring rain. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a dog barked twice, probably Lena Harper's beagle. Then came the low, steady clang of a tin sign on the old post office door catching wind. Nothing unusual, and yet something felt off-axis. Just a few degrees, like the world had shifted a little while you were sleeping, and now every familiar object had to be renegotiated. When Harold stepped back inside, Moss was gone. Pip had the look of a child who knew he should say something but didn't have the words. He pointed toward the back porch, then curled both hands into his lap like he'd said too much. Harold followed, out past the woodshed, just beyond the blackberry bushes. The wire fence bent slightly. Nothing dramatic, just a sag where the post had come loose in the soft earth. And there, crouched behind it like a boy in trouble, was Pip. On the other side of the fence stood Mrs. Hawthorne's bulldog, Rufus, big, slow, famously grumpy. Except this morning, he wasn't growling. He was wagging his tail like he was meeting someone he hadn't seen since puppyhood. Pip was imitating a bird, not whistling. He wasn't quite there, but making a strange, clicking, chirping sound that somehow matched the blackbird song in the tree above. Rufus barked once, tilted his head, and let out a low, wheezy huff. Moss stood 10 feet back, arms crossed, watching. Harold didn't call out, just leaned against a tree and watched. Pip reached into the waistband of his pants and pulled out a clothespin. Bright red. Snapped it open, closed it again, then offered it to Rufus, who sniffed it, then promptly licked his hand. The fence groaned, and in a blink, Moss moved. Fast, but silent. He slid forward, grabbed Pip by the back of his fur, and yanked him back over the sagging fence like a mama cat retrieving a kitten. No growl, no noise, just a fierce, clean movement. Then Harold saw it. On the back of Moss's hand, a faint white mark. A straight line, healed but visible. A scar, a familiar kind. He'd seen that line on children before. Ones who'd tried to push through steel cages. Ones who'd tested the sharp edge of fences. The kind who never quite learned what was allowed. Later that day, Harold found a pile of socks behind the couch. Not his socks, not even ones that matched. Just random, clean, mismatched socks. some adult-sized, some kid-sized, some with faded cartoons. Pip had arranged them in a circle, and in the center, like an offering, he'd placed the red clothespin. Harold didn't touch it. He sat beside it, just stared. They weren't hoarding, they weren't stealing, they were collecting, or maybe preserving. That evening, Harold went down into town. It wasn't part of the plan, but he needed milk and maybe a glance at someone else's face, just to remember what ordinary looked like. Ridgway hadn't changed. The same warped screen door at the gas station. Same creak in the floorboards of O'Neill's Market. Same slow nod from old man Gruber behind the register, who hadn't smiled since Nixon resigned. But there was a tone. You could feel it when you walked in, a stiffness. People paused mid-conversation when Harold walked by. Not rudely, just too quiet. He passed Lena Harper on the corner. She was pinning up a garage sale sign. She smiled. "Hey, Harold." He tipped his cap. "Lena." She looked past him, toward the hills. "Storm didn't do too much damage out your way?" "Nope." "Kids still getting into mischief?" He hesitated. Just a second too long, then nodded. "Always." Lena smiled again, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She tucked her hair behind her ear, then said, almost casually, "You hear about Mrs. Hawthorne's laundry?" Harold froze. Lena didn't press, just gestured toward the hills. "Sometimes I think this whole town's built on keeping things unspoken, like we all know too much, and that's the only way we stay civil." Then she walked away. When Harold returned home, there was a note tucked into the screen door. No envelope, no name, just a half sheet of paper, lined, torn from a notebook. Scrawled in tidy cursive were 6 words. "Don't make the children afraid." He stood there for a long time, just staring at that note. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a pact. When he stepped inside, the first thing he saw was Pip, sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding up a hand mirror like it was a compass. Moss was behind him, brushing his fur with one of Harold's old combs. Not grooming, calming. And for the first time, Harold didn't see creatures. He saw survivors. The next day, 3 towels went missing from a backyard line on Sycamore Street. A set of pajamas vanished from Lena's porch railing. The Harper twins came home crying that their Halloween masks were gone. No one filed reports. No one knocked on Harold's door. But the eyes changed. The way people looked at him in the diner. The way conversation paused when he walked past. The way whispers rose just a tick too high to be mistaken for background noise. Ridgway had always been good at 2 things, keeping secrets and pretending there were none. And now, something had cracked. Not wide, not loud, just enough. Enough for old women to start folding extra blankets and leaving them on porches. Enough for neighbors to start locking their sheds, not out of fear, but out of quiet, unspoken understanding. And Harold started looking at the hills differently. Not like boundaries, more like thresholds. That night, as he sat by the fire, Pip brought him a rubber duck, bright yellow, cracked on one side. Harold stared at it. "Where'd you get this?" Pip didn't answer, just placed it gently in Harold's hand, then curled up by his foot. Moss stood by the door, watching the woods. No threat, just readiness. And somewhere, deep in Harold Boone's chest, something began to settle. A quiet truth, that in this town, in this moment, some people had already seen enough to know what mattered, and they'd chosen silence. Not out of fear, but out of mercy. The kind of mercy only older folks understand. The kind that doesn't ask questions when the answers would only make things harder. The kind that sees a circle of socks on the floor and understands it's not about stealing. It's about trying to remember what belonging felt like. Harold placed the duck on the mantel. He didn't speak, and neither did the fire. But something somewhere whispered, "Let them stay." And just like that, the world outside didn't feel quite so loud. Not yet, but soon. Under the stillness of early April mornings in Ridgway, the forest always breathed quieter than the town. It held a hush between trees, a kind of waiting that Harold Boone had grown to respect. The air was crisp and not yet green, the kind of chill that sank into your sleeves if you stayed too long on the porch. That morning, Harold sat at the edge of the steps with his second cup of coffee, watching the sky lighten in thin streaks behind the birch line. Pip sat nearby, knees tucked under his chin, still chewing the last of a pear. Moss was further back, perched on the split rail fence like a gargoyle, rigid, listening, like the trees themselves had started whispering something he didn't like. The woods hadn't felt wrong exactly, just different, too quiet in the places that were usually loud. No woodpeckers, no squirrels scampering along the path. Harold hadn't said it out loud, but something in his chest already knew. Things were shifting, and not just inside the cabin. It happened when Harold went to refill the seed tray behind the shed. The birds hadn't touched it in 2 days, which was odd, but not unheard of. What caught his eye was the patch of disturbed soil near the edge of his property line, just where the grass gave way to fur and shadow. He walked closer, boots soft in the damp underbrush, and squatted near the bend in the fence. That's when he saw it. Thin wire, taut, strung ankle-high between 2 trees. At first, his brain fought to label it. Maybe an old clothesline or fencing wire from the last owner. But the rust was fresh. The tension was clean. And at one end, coiled neatly beside the base of a stump, sat a spring-loaded trigger. A snare. Pip appeared behind him without sound. No warning. The moment he saw the wire, his entire body went stiff. Not with surprise, but something deeper. Something buried. His eyes locked on it, wide and unblinking. His hands trembled. Not a twitch. True trembling. The kind that starts deep in the muscles. Then he bolted, ran full speed toward the cabin. Harold stood too fast, caught a root with his heel, and nearly slipped. When he steadied, Moss was already beside him, having come from God knows where in under 10 seconds. Moss stared at the snare, not in confusion, but with recognition. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He reached down, not touching the wire, but tracing the path with his fingers in the dirt, following it to the trigger, then to the tree. Then he looked up at Harold, not afraid, not questioning, just waiting. Harold nodded. They didn't say anything else. They didn't have to. That afternoon, Moss refused to go near the back trail. Pip wouldn't leave the house at all. He curled behind the wood stove with his face buried in Harold's old Carhartt jacket. Not asleep, just hidden. Harold found himself pacing more than usual, checking locks that didn't need checking, watching the tree line. At dusk, he put the porch light on for the first time in years. Just let it burn. The next day, Moss led him to the marker. They had gone walking just past noon, the kind of silent walk where Moss always kept Pip close, one hand lightly brushing his shoulder like a tether. Pip had begun to settle again, slowly, his gait lightening the deeper they went. But then Moss stopped, pointed. The tree was older than the rest, thick and crooked, bark dark with moss. On its trunk, carved into the wood just above eye level, was a symbol. Not spray paint, not chainsawed, carved, precise. 2 interlocking triangles, upside down. Below them, a series of slashes, 4 vertical, 1 across. Harold didn't speak. Moss touched the carving, then stepped back. The way his shoulders tightened told Harold more than words ever could. This wasn't random. This was a warning, and it wasn't meant for Harold. It was meant for them. By the time they got back to the house, Pip was quieter than usual, and Moss kept looking over his shoulder. That night, Harold pulled out his old file box from the attic, the one he hadn't opened since retiring. It was filled with old case records from the clinic, wildlife forms, reports he'd filed when he was still doing field consults for the state, traps, tags, relocations, medical logs. He flipped through them slowly. Some part of him had started remembering things he didn't want to remember. The sound of steel doors slamming, the clinical hum of overhead lights, crying that didn't sound like any animal he'd ever treated, voices arguing behind mirrored glass. He'd been younger then. He didn't ask questions. He just signed forms. Down the hill, in the town proper, the rumors were starting to move again. Harold stopped in at the feed store and heard two men talking low near the counter. They didn't mention names, just phrases. Something out by Boone's, weird tracks by the creek. Heard a sound didn't belong to no coyote. When Harold stepped past, they nodded politely. But their eyes lingered. On his clothes, on the mud on his boots, on the shape of the world they were guessing at. 2 days later, a Jeep with out-of-state plates showed up at the general store. The driver asked Lena for directions to the fire trail. Didn't say why. Didn't buy anything. Just left. That same evening, Harold found another snare. This one closer. Only 20 feet from the back fence. Fresh. He dismantled it himself. Hands steady. Jaw tight. He didn't tell Moss or Pip. But Moss knew. He could tell by the way the creature hovered near the porch after dusk. Never fully relaxing. Always watching. And Pip. Pip started flinching every time a metal sound echoed through the woods. A nail dropping. The clink of a tool. Even the sound of the stovetop trivet falling made him curl into himself. Hands pressed to his ears like armor. That was the night Harold realized he didn't live with creatures. He lived with survivors of a system he'd once been a part of. Not a monster, not a myth, but something raised inside fences, taught when to sleep, when to eat, when to obey, and somehow escaped. He started seeing it in the little things. The way Moss separated food by size, by type, by color. The way Pip flinched when too many lights were on at once. The way Moss took exactly 5 seconds to answer movement. Never more, never less. These weren't habits of the wild. They were leftovers from something organized, refined, painful. Later that week, Harold watched Moss gesture to a patch of ferns behind the cabin. 3 fingers extended, then 2, then 1. Pip nodded, then crouched, waited. Moved when Moss did. Not a game, a drill, a memory. Harold sat on the steps that night, watching the sky darken with the weight of another storm. He held his 3rd cup of coffee and didn't drink a drop. Inside, Pip was humming a low, unmelodic sound. Moss sat beside the door, knife-sharp stillness, staring at the woods. And Harold knew the rules they lived by weren't instinct. They were learned, taught, reinforced, paid for. And now, even in a place as old and quiet as his cabin, those rules were still with them. He couldn't erase them. But maybe, just maybe, he could soften the edges. He turned on the porch light again, left the door unlatched, and sat, eyes open, listening to a forest that had never really forgotten anything. Not pain, not rules, not even mercy. And something in him understood. He wasn't just shelter anymore. He was a witness. To lives rebuilt in silence. To trust built without language. To rules paid for in blood and fear. And he would protect them. Not because he had to, but because someone once should have, and didn't. And now the forest had begun speaking again, not with growls, but with traps, with signs, with men who came asking questions. Harold Boone sat in the dark and waited, not afraid, not quite, but ready for what came next. It started with a box Harold hadn't touched in over 8 years, a plain manila folder, 2nd drawer down in the old file cabinet he kept in the corner of the storage room behind the kitchen pantry. He hadn't planned to open it, hadn't planned to dig through anything that smelled like old decisions and state-issue ink. But that morning, with the sound of Pip softly humming to himself under the kitchen table and Moss sitting stone still by the window, something in Harold shifted. Maybe it was the tension that had been building for days, the snare, the scar on Pip's wrist, the silence that Moss carried like a second skin. Or maybe it was the note he'd found tucked beneath the doormat the night before, typed, not handwritten. No name, no return address. They were tagged, check your own papers. The box was dust-covered, warped a little on the bottom from some old moisture damage. But the files inside were still dry. He sat at the table and pulled them out one by one, laying them in stacks. Wildlife records, relocation logs, veterinary discharge sheets from a time he barely allowed himself to remember. Back when he worked on contract with the state. Back when they didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer any. He'd seen strange things then. Animals that didn't fit the paperwork. Cases with missing context. Creatures that came in quiet and went out quieter. The agency always called them non-natives. Said they were genetic anomalies. Said their behavior wasn't stable. Said they had to be studied before they could be released. He never asked where they went after that. Now he was asking. His fingers paused on a beige envelope. Unlabeled. Not filed under anything in particular. Just tucked there like it had been waiting. He slid it out. It was heavier than it should have been. Inside, 8 photographs. Glossy. Official. Clinical. The first image was of 2 juvenile figures standing against a gridded backdrop, like suspects in a booking photo. One was slightly taller, arms longer than proportion suggested. Broad shoulders. A subtle, defiant tilt to the chin. The other, smaller, crouched low, with wide eyes and a hand placed near the chest like it didn't know where else to put it. The fur, the stature, the eyes. Harold's heart clenched. It was them. Moss and Pip. He knew it as surely as he knew his own hands. The angle of Pip's shoulder, the slope of Moss's brow. He flipped the photo. Date, September 18th, 1989. Classification, JN14B, JN14C. Status, subject to early release. In the corner, his own signature. Harold Boone, DMV, Elk County Wildlife and Rescue. He stared at that name like it belonged to someone else. He remembered that week. Remembered the intake. The quiet tension in the facility. The directive to evaluate quickly and move them out of state jurisdiction. He hadn't stayed long. Just performed a basic intake exam. No sedation. They had been too still to require it. Moss hadn't flinched when Harold approached. Pip had only whimpered once, then gone completely silent. Harold hadn't looked them in the eye. He hadn't thought about it again. He had signed off and walked away. Now here they were, sleeping in the corner of his living room. He closed the file and sat very, very still. It wasn't guilt at first, not exactly. It was something stranger, a split down the middle of himself. The man who had turned the page, and the man who now lived with the consequences of what was written on it. That afternoon, he didn't speak much. Pip noticed, stayed close to Moss, shadowing his every step. Even when Harold offered him a slice of warm cornbread, Pip hesitated. Not out of fear, but something else. Something like instinct. Harold nodded. Didn't push. Moss kept his eyes on Harold longer than usual. Measured but not angry. Just waiting. And when night fell, and the house went quiet again, Harold pulled a second blanket from the closet and laid it gently over Pip's curled body by the fire. Then he sat across the room, watching the flames shift, flicker, swallow themselves. I didn't know, he said aloud. He wasn't sure if either of them was awake. I didn't know what they'd do with you. The fire crackled. I didn't ask. And for the first time since they'd come, Moss crossed the room, sat down beside Harold's chair, not close, not touching, but near enough that the distance between them didn't feel impossible anymore. They sat like that for a long time. Harold didn't sleep that night. The weight of it settled in his bones. That somewhere, years ago, he'd signed off on something, believing it wasn't his job to look deeper, believing it was just part of the system. And somehow, against all odds, those same creatures had found their way back to his door. Not to punish, not even to ask, just to be, to breathe the same air, to wait for someone who wouldn't look away this time. The next morning, Pip crawled into Harold's lap without a word, pressed his forehead gently to Harold's chest, and exhaled. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't even trust. It was recognition. Harold didn't cry, but something inside him cracked open. Later that day, Moss followed him out to the shed. They didn't speak. But as Harold worked on reinforcing the fence, Moss crouched beside him and began sorting the tools without being asked, organizing them by size, function, handle length, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. And Harold, hands deep in the soil, understood something clearer than any paperwork ever could. He hadn't rescued them. He hadn't saved anyone. They had saved themselves, had endured, had escaped, and somehow, despite everything, had chosen to walk into his life, chosen to stay, He glanced up once as Moss gently passed him a wrench. Their eyes met, and in that one glance, a lifetime passed between them. Not of words, but of understanding. Harold Boone had signed a file once, had let two beings be taken into a system that broke more than it healed. He would carry that weight. But he would also carry this, that they had chosen him anyway, not because he deserved it, but because something in them still believed, maybe just barely, that not all doors stayed closed forever, and maybe that was enough. For now, the woods were quiet that evening, and the cabin, for the first time in years, felt like a place where something could grow again. Not fast, not without pain, but real. And as Harold sat on the porch with Pip leaning against his side and Moss watching the ridgeline with eyes sharper than any rifle, he understood something he'd never known back then. That healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from choosing to remember, and staying anyway. The file was never put back in the cabinet. He burned it 2 days later, page by page, and watched the ashes curl up toward the sky like smoke signals in reverse. Not calling anyone in, but finally, letting something go. It was just after midnight when Harold woke to the sound. Not loud, not sharp, more like a breath caught in the throat, a low whimper threaded through the hush of the cabin. The kind of sound that doesn't alarm you at first, but unsettles you all the same. The fire had dimmed to a deep red glow, pulsing inside the stove like a heart slowed by cold. Rain tapped faintly against the tin roof. April rain, soft, persistent, not dramatic, just enough to remind the world it was alive. Harold sat up slowly, joints stiff. The armchair creaked beneath him, familiar and tired. He didn't reach for his glasses right away. He listened first. There it was again, a muffled cry, then another, short, choked. Pip. Harold eased out of the chair, barefoot, careful not to step on the old loose floorboard near the rug. The lamp stayed off. He didn't need it. The dim orange glow from the stove was enough to cast long shadows across the cabin, shapes he knew by muscle memory now. The edge of the table, the wood bin, Moss's silhouette, curled near the front door, shoulders tense even in sleep. But Pip, he was trembling in his sleep, curled too tight on the cushion they'd turned into his bed, hands clenched against his chest. His mouth moved, but no words came. Only those soft broken sounds, like fear trying not to wake the house. Harold knelt down beside him, didn't touch, just waited. Pip's legs twitched. One arm flailed, struck the floor, then recoiled. A stifled sob escaped. It wasn't animal. It was heartbreak. The kind you hear in emergency rooms and orphanages. The kind that comes from remembering things the body isn't built to carry. Harold reached out and laid a hand gently on the side of Pip's back, just between the shoulders. Warm, soft pressure. No words. Pip flinched once, then went still. Then, slowly, his small hand reached out blindly, found Harold's wrist, and held. The grip was weak, but full of need. Harold stayed there, breathing, matching the rhythm of Pip's chest, slowing his own heart until it matched the boy's. Then from the doorway, movement. Moss rose without sound and crossed the floor in 2 long steps. He crouched beside Pip, one hand already resting on the boy's head. Protective, anchoring. His other arm slid beneath Pip's shoulders, pulling him close, not shaking him awake, just gathering him. Pip turned instinctively, face pressed into Moss's chest. A soft whine. One word, maybe, but not in English. Not in any language Harold knew. Just the weight of it, like a cry carried across too many nights. Moss didn't speak, didn't soothe like a human would. He just held on, head bowed, eyes closed. Harold stepped back, sat on the floor, knees creaking, heart full. He'd seen that posture before. On hospital benches, in burned-out mothers cradling inconsolable toddlers, in dogs reunited with their wounded pups, in men who'd buried sons. It was the same shape, the same ache. Pip calmed slowly. The tremors didn't stop, but they softened. His breaths came in small hiccups, then longer, slower pulls of air. Harold watched Moss's face. He wasn't just shielding. He was reliving. Harold recognized it in the stillness. The kind of silence where memory floods the body. Moss had done this before. Not once, not twice, too many times. Somewhere in that moment, Harold felt the line blur again. Between them and him, between what he'd been and what he was becoming. The cabin creaked as the wind shifted. A gust pushed against the window pane, and Pip startled again. But this time, instead of crying, he reached out blindly, grabbed Harold's shirt, and pulled. Not away. Closer. So Harold went. He lay down beside them. Not touching, just near. Close enough that Pip could hear his breath, feel the warmth. Then he did something he hadn't done since before Marlene died. He breathed on purpose, in a rhythm, deep, slow, steady. A trick he used to teach in grief therapy groups, back when he volunteered on Wednesdays at the hospice center. 3 seconds in, hold. 5 seconds out. Again, soft, gentle. He didn't speak, didn't hum, just let the breath fill the space. Within minutes, Pip's grip on his shirt loosened. Moss shifted his weight but didn't let go, and for the first time since they'd come, Pip truly slept, not just rested. Slept. No twitches, no fear, just the soft, complete surrender of a child who believes, for a moment, that he's safe. Harold didn't move. He let the hours pass on the hardwood floor, let the stove burn low, watched the first faint blue light of morning stretch across the ceiling. And when he finally stood, knees stiff, arms numb, Pip didn't stir. But something else caught his eye. As Moss gently pulled the blanket back over the boy's arm, a scar glinted in the firelight. A small, round ring right around the wrist, smooth, shiny in the center, like something had been clamped there, held tight. For too long, Harold stared. The ache in his chest spread. It wasn't theoretical anymore. Wasn't just a guess about past cruelty. It was proof. Undeniable, and something in him cracked wider. Not from guilt, not from anger, from something older. The deep, wordless ache of seeing pain in someone who couldn't name it anymore. Later that morning, as Moss dozed on the couch and Pip sat on the porch eating cold cereal out of Harold's favorite mixing bowl, Harold took out a sheet of paper. He didn't know what he planned to write. Maybe a letter to no one. Maybe just a record. All he managed were 5 words. He doesn't cry like animals. Then he crossed it out. Wrote, "He dreams like a child," and left it there. That night, when they all gathered by the fire again, Pip curled beneath Harold's old quilt, Moss perched as usual by the window. Harold felt something he hadn't known he'd missed. Not peace, not exactly joy. Something older than both. Belonging. Not the kind you earn, the kind you recognize when it shows up, silent and battered, on your doorstep. Family. The kind that forms before you know what to call it. The kind that doesn't need explanation or permission, just presence. And in that silence, in that slow rhythm of shared breath and firelight, Harold Boone knew one thing with a clarity sharper than any pain, that families don't start with blood. They start with moments like this, with fear softened by touch, with breath shared in the dark, with the quiet courage of holding on and not letting go. Even when everything in the world told you to run, he didn't say it aloud. Didn't have to. But if he had, it would have been simple. You're mine now, and I'm yours, no matter what comes next. It began with the sound of tires crunching gravel. Slow, deliberate. Not a neighbor, not the mailman. This was someone who didn't belong. The kind of sound that carries different weight when you live at the edge of town, when your driveway is long and uninviting and never gets visitors without warning. Harold was on the porch, mug in hand, watching birds pick at the feeder. Pip sat near the steps with a bent spoon he'd adopted as a tool for digging invisible treasure. Moss was perched on the split-rail fence, eyes already locked on the bend in the road. He didn't move, but his whole posture sharpened. His breathing slowed, like the forest itself had just drawn a line. A black SUV eased around the corner. Clean. Too clean for Ridgeway. Government plates, but scrubbed. Harold didn't move, not right away. He set his mug down slow, placed it on the railing, then stepped down beside Pip and rested a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. Pip looked up. His eyes searched Harold's face before shifting to the sound, and then they widened. The SUV stopped halfway up the drive. Engine idled for 3 seconds. Then it shut off. The doors didn't open. Not yet. Moss was off the fence by then. He didn't speak, didn't bark or growl. He just moved, fast, quiet. Between Pip and the cabin, arms loose at his sides, head slightly lowered. Not in fear, but in focus. Pip stood and instinctively pressed his back to Moss's leg, slipping behind him like the move had been rehearsed in another life. Harold stepped forward, only 2 feet, enough to put himself between the porch and the unknown. The driver's door opened. A man climbed out, mid-40s, trim, hat pulled low. Aviators, the kind of plane that's hard to remember after. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. "You Harold Boone?" Harold didn't answer. He watched the man's eyes, waited for the flick, just a flick, toward Pip or Moss, and there it was, a twitch of interest, a moment too long. "Nice place," the man said, scanning the tree line. "Lot of room out here." Harold nodded once. "Plenty of space." The man stepped closer, but not far. Just enough for his boots to settle in the gravel like they belonged. "I'm looking for something. Heard a couple of strange things around these parts lately. 2-legged shadows. You seen anything unusual?" Harold didn't blink. "Just squirrels." The man smirked, but it didn't reach his mouth. "Squirrels, huh?" He glanced back at the SUV. The back door opened now, slow. A second man stepped out. Taller, broad-shouldered, carried nothing, but his hands stayed loose like they wanted to be holding something. Binoculars, maybe. Or a leash. Harold saw it for what it was, a message. He stepped down 1 more pace. "You lost?" The second man spoke now. "We're following a trail. Kids said they saw something near the old lumber mill. Walked upright, left strange prints." Harold let the silence hold. The first man broke it. "We were told you're the kind of man who notices things. That maybe you could point us in the right direction." Pip whimpered. Not loud, just one small exhale of fear. Moss's hand dropped gently to the boy's shoulder. Harold heard it, but the men didn't. He took another step forward. "No directions here, just trees. They all look the same once you walk 20 feet in." The taller man looked past Harold toward the cabin. "You live out here alone?" "No," Harold said, voice even. "Not anymore." The first man cocked his head. "You know what's at stake here?" Harold nodded. "Do you?" There was something ancient in that moment. Something unspoken. 2 roads meeting. 2 stories clashing at the edge of something neither fully understood. The taller man shifted his weight like he might move, but he didn't. Not yet. Then a sound came from the woods. Sharp, close. Not a branch, not an owl. Something heavy, deliberate, walking. All 3 men turned, and out of the tree line stepped a figure. Not charging, not hiding, just arriving. 9 feet tall, massive, covered in dark, damp fur that seemed to drink the light. Shoulders broader than any human, arms long and slow-moving. It didn't make a sound. Its eyes, though, those eyes locked on the SUV, then on the men, then on Moss, and lastly, on Harold. Not threat, judgment. It stepped forward once more. The ground didn't shake, but the moment did. The 2 men didn't move, didn't reach for anything. They knew. You could see it in the way their bodies froze. Not like cowards, but like men who'd seen power once and never wanted to again. The creature stopped 10 feet from Harold. Moss didn't flinch. Pip didn't cry. They stood like branches behind him, rooted, unmoving. The man with the sunglasses raised one hand, slow, not as greeting, not as threat. Then he turned. He didn't speak. He got back in the SUV. The taller one followed. The doors shut. The engine roared. The tires backed slowly, then sped up as they turned down the gravel and disappeared into the trees. They didn't look back. The forest went still again. No birds, no wind, just the sound of breathing. 4 bodies exhaling. Harold turned to the creature. The elder. It didn't speak, just looked at him with a depth that felt like drowning. Then it nodded, once, barely perceptible, turned and walked back into the trees. No fanfare, no storm, just the forest closing behind it, sealing the space like nothing had happened. But everything had. Harold stood still for a long time. Then he turned to Moss and Pip. They didn't say anything. But Pip stepped out from behind his brother and looked up at Harold. Not with fear this time. Not even with wonder. With relief, like something inside him had let go of a knot he'd been carrying too long. Later, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the porch light buzzed to life, Harold walked the fence line again. He found the trap just beneath the window. New, carefully hidden. The wire wasn't rusted. Fresh meat tied to a trigger. Close enough to catch a child who stepped too far. He dismantled it quietly. Didn't mention it to Moss. Didn't need to, because something had changed. Not in the woods. In Harold. This wasn't his home alone anymore. It never had been. He just hadn't known he'd been chosen to guard something sacred. Not because he was strong or wise, but because he hadn't closed the door. And now, when danger came knocking, it hadn't been him who stood guard. It had been them. The ones who had no voice in town meetings, no name on the mailbox, no seat at the table. But they were the law here. The original law. And tonight, the law had been upheld. Not with blood, not with force, but with presence. And when Harold finally sat back down on the porch, pulled the blanket over Pip's lap, and felt Moss lean against the post beside him, he realized something strange and beautiful. He wasn't the protector. He was the threshold. And that was enough. For now, it snowed early that year. Not much. Just a dusting. Enough to coat the pines with white breath and hush the ground underfoot. Enough to cover the steps in fine powder by the time Harold opened the door that morning, pulling his flannel close around his chest and exhaling steam into the crisp stillness of November's end. The air carried that first hint of true winter, not sharp, but certain, not loud, but final. Pip was already awake, forehead pressed to the frosted window, tracing shapes into the fog with his finger. Moss sat cross-legged near the stove, sharpening a stick with quiet focus, his head tilting every so often toward the wind outside, like he was listening for something he hadn't heard in years. It had been 2 weeks since the SUV, since the wire trap near the window, since the elder stepped from the tree line and returned without a sound, since the unspoken understanding that Harold Boone was no longer just shelter, but something else entirely. The town had quieted too. No more questions. No more sightings mentioned in whispers behind coffee mugs. Whatever word had passed through the hills had worked. There were no more footsteps on the gravel. No more curious stares at the grocery. Just space. And silence. The kind you only get once the fear has been replaced by respect. And something else had started to shift too. The neighbors. It began small. Mrs. Hawthorne left a bundle of flannel on the porch one afternoon. Didn't knock. Just set it down in the old milk crate, like she'd done it every day of her life. Inside were 2 child-sized quilts, hand-stitched, one with a faded pattern of owls and pine cones, the other green with patches of old denim sewn in at the corners. Caleb, the teenage boy from the hill up the road, didn't say a word either. Just jogged up the path one chilly morning, placed 2 apples and a bag of walnuts on the railing, and took off running before Harold could even open the door. Pip found the fruit an hour later. He lined them up in the snow like trophies, and Moss, without a word, gathered the apples and split one in half with bare hands, offering the bigger piece to his brother. Harold stood in the doorway, mug in hand, and watched them. Watched the simple rhythm of it, the quiet grace of beings who'd never been taught to expect kindness but still knew how to accept it when it came. Later that night, as snow fell in slow silence through the trees, Harold sat by the fire with a notebook on his lap. He hadn't written in years. Not really. But something about the weight of this winter, this moment, called for memory, for naming. He didn't know where to begin, so he wrote what was true. They never asked to stay. They just did. And I never asked them to leave. That part was mine. Moss was asleep by the door, one hand resting near the edge of the rug, like a sentinel even in dreams. Pip lay curled beneath the owl quilt, a soft snore rising and falling with the rhythm of the flames. Every now and then, he'd reach out, touch the hem of Harold's boot, then tuck his hand back under the covers, as if to make sure the man hadn't gone anywhere. And Harold hadn't. He couldn't, not anymore. The next day, after lunch, Harold stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the tree line. He didn't say anything, but he was thinking about it, returning them. Not because he wanted to, but because he wondered if he was holding them back, if the woods still whispered their names at night, if there were others waiting. A family. A place where they could live without fear, without boundaries. A place where being what they were wasn't dangerous. He didn't say the words out loud, but Moss felt it. That afternoon, while Pip napped and the fire cracked lazily in the stove, Moss came to stand beside him, didn't speak, just looked at Harold. Then he pressed his palm gently to his chest and held it there, a quiet, deliberate motion, then turned and did the same to Pip, still sleeping on the couch, his hand over the boy's chest. 2 beats. Then he looked back at Harold and nodded once. Not goodbye, not permission. Just one word that didn't need saying. Here, Harold didn't ask for more. That evening, he made stew. Real stew. Not just cans dumped into a pot. He chopped the carrots thin like Marlene used to, added thyme and garlic and bay leaves. Let it simmer long enough for the scent to reach the rafters. Moss tasted it first, careful, polite. Pip shoved 3 spoonfuls in before Harold even finished saying, careful. It felt like a celebration, but nothing was said. They didn't need to. Later, after dishes and tea, Harold sat in his chair, blanket over his legs, watching the snow drift heavier now outside the window. And then it happened. 3 sets of shoulders touched. Not planned, not prompted. Pip crawled up first, climbed into Harold's lap, head tucked into his chest like it had always belonged there. Then Moss. He moved slowly, almost shy, and sat on the floor beside the chair. Leaned gently against Harold's leg. Didn't look up. Just rested his weight there. Solid, steady. Harold didn't speak. He just placed one hand on each of their backs. The warmth of that moment, its silence, was bigger than anything words could hold. They stayed like that for a long time. 3 hearts beating, 3 lives held in the same space, no one needing to explain why. No need for witness, just truth, resting like snowfall on an old rooftop. And when Pip finally shifted, eyelids heavy, breath slowing against Harold's chest, Moss didn't rise. He just leaned in and closed his eyes. And Harold, he didn't cry, but his hand trembled once, only once. The fire burned low. The snow piled high on the steps, and the woods, once watchers, now stood guard. Not with weapons, not with traps, but with silence, with distance, with respect. That night, Harold didn't lock the door, didn't close the blinds. He didn't have to anymore. By morning, the cabin was wrapped in white. Quiet, untouched, but not alone, not anymore. There were footprints across the porch, 2 human, one larger, wide-toed, deliberate, leading to the door, not away. He smiled when he saw them, smiled deeper when he noticed something else on the railing. A bundle of twigs, tied with dried grass, shaped like a circle. Tucked in the center, a feather and a stone. Gift, message, acknowledgement. No one saw them leave it. No one needed to. Later that morning, Harold found Pip standing at the window again, staring out silent. Moss came up behind him, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Pip didn't speak. He didn't have to. Whatever they were watching for, it wasn't danger. Just recognition. A nod back to something older than memory. Harold turned to go back to the fire, but before he could take a step, Pip looked over his shoulder, walked up to him, and held out his hand. Inside his palm, small fingers cupped around something invisible. Then he opened them and pointed to Harold's chest, then to Moss, then back to himself, then closed his hand tight. Harold didn't say anything. He couldn't, so he knelt down and pulled Pip close and stayed there until the kettle whistled. until the snow began to fall again, until the day slipped into dusk without anyone noticing. And that night, with the world turned soft and white, with no threats, no fences, no signatures or science to explain what had unfolded, Harold Boone finally understood the thing that had been forming around him all this time. It wasn't charity. It wasn't rescue. It wasn't even redemption. It was a home, built not from blood, but from choice, from breath shared in the dark, from doors left open, and the courage to answer when someone knocked like a child. Even now, if you asked him, he wouldn't say the word family. He'd just point to the old armchair, where two strange, sacred lives once curled beside him. He'd tell you, sometimes you're not chosen because you're ready. You're chosen because someone had the bravery to ask, and you were decent enough to say yes. That's all it takes to begin again. And maybe, just maybe, that's what lasts. There are stories that linger, not because they're loud or grand or filled with spectacle, but because they touch something we almost forgot was there. A quiet corner of ourselves we rarely show. The part that still believes in kindness without agenda. In showing up without being asked. In leaving the door unlocked, just in case someone brave enough decides to knock. This story was never really about the extraordinary. It was about the ordinary moments that became sacred, not because of what happened, but because of how someone responded. A warm place offered in the cold. A silence respected. A gesture returned. It was about what happens when we pause long enough to see what isn't easy to understand, and choose not to turn away. Because sometimes the things that seem wild at first, the things we're taught to fear or control, or push back into the shadows, are the very things that teach us what it means to love, to witness, to grow. And not just love in the familiar way, love as duty, love as blood, but the rarer kind, the kind that chooses, the kind that costs something, the kind that requires you to stay, even when leaving would be easier, even when there's no map. What if family isn't who we're born to, but who we become home for? What if healing doesn't look like forgetting the past, but holding it gently and saying, you can rest here now? And what if safety isn't built with fences or rules or signatures, but with listening, with time, with grace? Maybe the measure of a life well lived isn't how much we build or earn or prove, but how well we guard the quiet, sacred things entrusted to us. Maybe the real test of character is what we do when someone asks for shelter, not with words, but with eyes, with trembling hands, with hope they're not even sure they're allowed to feel. And maybe, just maybe, none of us are really alone out there. Maybe we're all just waiting for someone who won't turn away. So if you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening with your heart open, for staying with the story even when it slowed down, when it asked you to feel instead of judge, to remember instead of explain. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What stayed with you? What part whispered to something deep inside you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. It matters more than you know. And if this story found a place in you, consider subscribing and joining this growing circle of people who still believe in wonder, in compassion, in the quiet power of saying yes when someone knocks. Until next time, keep the fire lit, keep the door unlocked, and above all, stay kind.